on Under Investigation, cruising on the high seas. For most, it's the holiday of a lifetime, but for some, it's a one-way trip.
Up to 1 million Australians a year going down those gangplanks, not fully aware that they were leaving the protection of Australian authorities behind.
With our panel of experts, we'll expose the hidden dangers.
They found her dead on the ship.
The assaults.
The sexual assault rate more than 50% greater than on land.
And a cruising culture.
This was a moment that shook up Australians, wasn't it?
It was, Liz.
We'll examine passenger protections, from falling overboard to going down with the ship. And we ask, just how safe are travellers in this new COVID world?
It's a perfect incubator for any kinds of illness that's transmitted between people.
Now that Australia is cruising again, we reveal what happens when it all goes wrong.
People are ending up in a town without a sheriff, being able to be preyed on by villains and despicable people.
Good evening, I'm Liz Hayes, and this is Under Investigation.
Joining me tonight from Brisbane, Mark Brimble, the Australian head of the International Cruise Ship Victims Organisation, whose former wife Diane Brimble died on a cruise ship. Graham Perrott, MP, who chaired a parliamentary inquiry into crimes at sea. From Canada, sociologist Professor Ross Klein, who's studying crimes on cruise ships. In Sydney, Professor Natalie Klein, an expert in international law of the sea. And Ron Honig, New South Wales State MP, who was counsel assisting the inquest into the death of Diane Brimble. Cruising has become a massive vacation industry. At its peak, 51 cruise lines with 320 ships plied the world's oceans.
It's huge. It's grown exponentially, doubling every 10 years. So in the 1960s, it had about 600,000 passengers. Today, worldwide, it would be over 25 million.
But with the explosive popularity come some appalling problems. From onboard brawls and passengers falling overboard, to drug and alcohol abuse, allegations of sexual assault, and even murder.
A lot of people get on a cruise ship thinking that this is going to be a trip of a lifetime, but the murky life that you can be drawn into, or the social situations you can be drawn into, are quite frightening.
But for the cruising industry and its passengers, the immediate challenge is COVID-19. 2.5 years ago, the government banned ships entering Australia following the Ruby Princess debacle and the mishandling of COVID cases on board.
Passengers led off into the streets of Sydney while the virus was on board.
It was a decision that triggered the country's first super spreader event.
Health checks at sea, evacuations, passengers dying.
The final tally saw 900 people infected with COVID, 28 of whom died. But earlier this year, the ban was lifted and cruising is now back in force.
But what has changed, and how safe are passengers?
I think there were really big lessons that had to be learned from the Ruby Princess and the havoc that wreaked on society at the time. But we still have COVID, and there's still a really strong need to make sure that people who go on cruise ships are going to be safe.
Unfortunately, despite several requests, the Cruise Lines International Association declined our invitation to join us tonight.
But Quentin Long, an advocate for cruising and co-founder of Australian Traveller magazine, has been looking at what a holiday on board is like in a COVID world and the new measures in place to prevent infection.
You can expect that you need to have at least 2 vaccination doses in your arm Also, you have to complete a PCR or RAT test. It's a self-administered RAT test and it is an honesty system. You have to then do a declaration before you embark. And then once on board, in places where you can't social distance, you'll be encouraged to wear a mask. Some cruise lines will make it mandatory. Things like the buffet, it'll be there, but you can't self-serve.
If we wrap ourselves in cotton wool, we're never going to go anywhere, are we?
I think Princess will look after us.
It's as safe on there as it probably is in the shopping centre.
However, despite their best intentions, the new protocols haven't stopped the virus.
The Coral Princess carrying unwanted cargo. On board, more than 120 COVID cases.
Ross Klein, there's no getting around. A ship is a confined space.
Yeah, it was a perfect incubator for any kinds of illness that's transmitted between people.
And so it was for Shirin Jewell and her daughters Scarlett and Tallulah.
We paid a whole lot of money to have this holiday that turned out to not really be a holiday at all.
They went on their first cruise together in July and came back with COVID.
I was very sick for a week. My youngest daughter was very sick. I'm really aware that there were other sick people because I connected on Instagram with quite a lot of people, and it was just, I don't know anyone that didn't contract it.
And Shirin believes COVID was able to spread because on-board rules seemed very lax.
Probably the biggest thing I noticed was in some of the venues, people weren't wearing masks, and there was really an attitude. People were talking, overheard them talking about how we're not putting up with this Nazi stuff, having no one there to marshal those things. That's the missed opportunity because that's how people got sick.
The industry says it's working with leading health authorities and state and federal governments to set in place COVID-safe protocols to ensure the well-being of passengers.
And I guess the key for you, Ron, is who's ensuring these protocols are enforced.
And you can't leave that to vested interests. You're going to need independent oversight. Somebody needs to be in control of health.
You don't think we can have self-regulation?
Well, I think we've seen before in relation to the cruise ship industry that self-regulation does not work in the medium to long term because what drives them are profits.
But this is what we're seeing here, aren't we, Natalie? Self-regulation?
It sounds very much like self-regulation in the way that the new protocols have been drafted. But the question is, well, if these things are not being followed, well, who would a passenger turn to in that situation? And what can we really expect will happen if these things are not being met as they should?
Of course, with all travel comes risk. And now cruising passengers will have to sign a statement acknowledging the risks of COVID-19 being on board. But the Australian cruise ship industry says it's well prepared to treat COVID outbreaks.
They now have dual sick bays. So one sick bay will be where they can actually isolate any cases of COVID that they need to, and meanwhile service non-COVID but ill people in a separate one.
But it might come at a cost. The industry says passengers will receive a free assessment for COVID, although it's unclear whether there will be a charge for treatment. That, says the industry, will be determined by the policies of individual cruise lines and their doctors on board.
They're a private contractor on board the ship. They're paid a stipend. Depending on the cruise line, it can be as high as $10,000 a month, but then they also charge for their services. So for office visits, for any types of prescriptions or any other kind of treatments, there's always a fee attached.
It's information passengers should know, given COVID seems ever present.
Just a few months ago, America's Centre for Disease Control stopped monitoring cruise ships infected with COVID, accepting that the virus was now a reality for passengers. And it should be noted that prior to cancelling the program, all 95 cruise liners who'd signed up to the CDC's program had COVID-19 on board. To have COVID on every ship that was being monitored, what does that tell us?
That COVID is here to stay and we have to accept it as part of the reality of going on a cruise ship.
But it's not just COVID passengers need to look out for. Holidaying on the high seas is far from being risk-free because cruise ships, many carrying more than 5,000 people, are like floating cities. And like cities ashore, they experience crime and other threats to public safety.
In the latest, up to 30 people were caught up in a fight that left passengers and crew injured.
You're talking about huge populations of people in a relatively confined space.
Australians often make a cruising vacation a family event, and many presume that if a crime occurs on board, it is dealt with as it would be on home soil. But at sea, law enforcement is a complex business. And many victims don't realise they're often not protected by Australian laws.
It's the government's ultimate responsibility to protect people's health, welfare and safety. And there is no government protection at all for those people who go onto these cruise ships.
And the reason for that is based on where the ship has been registered. Few Australians may notice the flag flying on the ship they're boarding, but that flag tells you where the ship has been registered and, importantly, the laws that will apply on board. It's called a flag of convenience, and it's almost never Australian.
Every company that owns a ship will look around and go, well, where is a good place to register? What's offering the reasonable fees? What kind of laws am I going to have apply to my company? So they choose the one that obviously brings the best profit for them. And so the flags of convenience, or more politely, they're referred to as the open registry states, usually known for not necessarily enforcing their laws as strictly perhaps as other jurisdictions.
And the countries where cruise lines often choose to register their ships include the Bahamas, Panama, Bermuda, the Marshall Islands and Ecuador.
For those ships that are within 12 nautical miles, that's about 20 kilometres from Australia's coast, Australian law can apply. But once we get onto the high seas, we're beyond those waters, then it's going to be the law of the flag state. And that's where we start running into problems.
And those problems can see passengers in a world of trouble. If there's a crime on board a ship that has its flag of convenience in Panama, Bahamas, wherever, that particular country is expected to be the ones who take control of the investigation?
They should be, yes.
And how quickly can they respond?
Well, they don't. So even where we do have standards and procedures, they're just not being implemented.
Many of the countries that offer cruise ship companies their flags of convenience have police forces that are ill-equipped to investigate crimes at sea.
I think people are under a misunderstanding that they'll be taking the protections of the Australian government, of the Australian police, with them when they go cruising around the waters of the Pacific or even the world, but that is clearly not the case. You've got flags of convenience vessels, you've got people that don't understand the laws of Australia, so it is a recipe for disaster.
Millions of travellers enjoy cruising the world on massive ships akin to floating cities, and many keep coming back for more. But tonight, we reveal the horror for passengers when it all goes wrong.
You could be murdered and there'll be no consequences.
Ron Honig, New South Wales MP and lawyer, says when a crime occurs, victims could be shocked by what doesn't occur.
The reality is that even under the current system, if you go embark on a cruise and something happens to you, they do not have the facilities to protect people.
And don't think it can't happen, says sociologist and industry investigator Ross Klein.
The issue of sexual assaults on cruise ships is not new, nor are murders on board cruise ships. Carnival Corporation admitted to 108 sexual assaults over 5 years. This would have been in 1999 in response to discovery in a lawsuit. Data from that period of time, the late 90s, early 2000s, indicate that the rate of sexual assault on some cruise lines was 115 per 100,000. That means that the sexual assault rate on board cruise ships was more than 50% greater than on land in Canada. So your risk of assault is considerably greater being on a ship than staying at home.
And Mark Brimble, as Australian head of the International Cruise Ship Victims Organisation, says first-hand reports he has received suggest many crimes are not reported.
I've had people calling me where they've been sexually assaulted on a ship, but the fear that they have of reporting that to the purser or any person that's in charge on board the ship is the repercussion of what may happen to them, because they've still got to stay on that ship for another 7 or 14 days. And they have a fear of being thrown overboard. They have a fear of losing what rights they may have had they been on mainland Australia. They don't have anyone to protect them. There's no police force.
Mark Brimble's knowledge of crime and antisocial behaviour on cruise ships and the industry's response follows a very personal experience. On Monday, September 23, 2002, Diane Brimble, Mark's former wife and mother of 3, boards the P&O Pacific Sky cruise liner in Sydney for a 10-day trip. She's with her sister, daughter and niece. They saved up for 2 years for their very first international cruise. After cocktails and dinner, Diane's niece and daughter retire for the night. Diane goes to the ship's disco. It would prove a fatal decision. The following morning, Diane is found dead in a cabin occupied by 4 men. Toxicology tests reveal she has ingested a cocktail of alcohol and the date rape drug GHB.
What happened for me was receiving the phone call letting me know that Diane had passed away and the ship was sailing between Sydney and Noumea.
Did anybody explain what had happened or what they believed had happened?
No, not a word. When they got the family off the gangplank at Noumea, they were finished with it. Frankly, they just didn't care.
Mark says from then on, he and his children heard little more from the cruise company or police.
Suddenly, 2 years later, I was called into the police station to be interviewed by a detective. And I said to the detective in that room, what happened? What is going on? Can somebody please tell me what happened to Diane?
And you were shocked?
Absolutely. I was put in the position where I had to try to explain to my own children what went on, what happened to their mother. They were living all that time not knowing what had happened to her, why she died.
4 years after Diane Brimble's death, a coronial inquest would hear the disturbing details.
She was subject to terrible degradation, absolutely reprehensible.
And also some disconcerting information about the police investigation.
Police officers who'd been getting free trips on cruises didn't want to admit they're having free trips on cruises.
Ron Honig was counsel assisting the coroner.
Police officers who were there to investigate Mrs. Brimble's death, dancing with witnesses in the disco, whom they were supposed to be interviewing. There was a fair bit wrong in going through the process.
No one was found guilty of murdering or assaulting Diane Brimble. And despite the coronial inquest detailing the use of illegal drugs and excessive alcohol, the cruise company continued with what appeared to be highly provocative advertising.
One of the most bizarre pieces of evidence we tendered was a postcard of P&O advertising cruise ships. 4 scantily clothed women in bikinis sitting on deck chairs, and a title of that was Seamen Wanted.
The coronial inquest exposed a number of serious failures by the cruise company, including not securing the room where Diane Brimble was found.
A senior crew member told a junior security officer guarding the room to step aside.
And the unforgivable loss of potential forensic evidence when the male occupants were allowed to re-enter the cabin.
He even saw one man pick up 2 white tablets and put them in his pocket.
The death of Diane Brimble prompted a parliamentary inquiry into the cruising industry, chaired by federal MP Graham Perrott.
I present the committee's report entitled Troubled Waters.
Graham Perrott, this was a moment that shook up Australians, wasn't it?
It was, Liz. We heard some incredible evidence of a culture of cover-up, of people not reporting up to the bridge, basically because it was in the interests of the company to keep quiet about bad behaviour that does take place on cruises.
The inquiry made a number of urgent recommendations to the government, including the mandatory reporting of crimes on Australian cruise ships. But incredibly, none were made compulsory.
There's a lot to be done to make sure that cruises are safer. Unfortunately, I feel that the Troubled Waters report might as well have been thrown in the bin when it comes to a government response.
Not even the simplest recommendation, an information pamphlet about crime and protection for boarding passengers, was enforced.
As Graham said, it should just be thrown in the bin because they've done nothing with it. They've allowed the industry to prosper. The industry did everything to clean up its image, but did nothing to clean up its act.
There are many outstanding issues. Many of the coroner's recommendations from the inquest into Diane Brimble have not yet been implemented, and all those are specifically designed to ensure the safety of passengers. The serious illness and death of one person is too high a price to pay for the economic interests of a cruise liner.
It should be noted that the industry says serious crimes on cruise ships operating out of Australia are relatively rare. But cruise line companies are not compelled to report a crime if it occurs in international waters.
I don't think that the statistics that the cruise industry are giving us are right, because there are drugs on board ships. There are crimes and assaults that are happening on board ships that are not reported.
It is different in America, though, where all cruise ships are governed by the Cruise Vessel Security and Safety Act, which means cruise companies must report all serious crime, suspicious deaths, missing persons, and theft of money or property in excess of $10,000.
There is no such law in Australia, but the Cruise Lines International Association says its members must follow a policy of reporting crimes on board.
This is them saying they are doing everything that they can and should do. What do you say to that?
Well, they define what's a crime. Under the law in the U.S., the Cruise Ship Security and Safety Act, it's the cruise line itself, their security, that defines whether or not an incident is a crime. So that if a woman is dancing on the dance floor and a man comes up and puts his hand down her underwear, if the cruise line says it is not a crime, whether the woman says it was sexual assault or not, the cruise line has defined it.
On the cruise, there's a lot of alcohol and there's a lot of drunk people.
Shirin Jewell, a recent passenger on a cruise out of Australia, experienced the alcohol-fuelled environment which can affect on-board behaviour.
I had very drunk people coming up and hugging me, and I was like, you're some random I don't know. You're giving me a hug.
It's the question of when is there going to be sufficient impetus to act. And I think we are getting increasing pressure around doing something about crimes on cruise ships. We saw extraordinary changes in the industry after the September 11 attacks, and that's when the roles of safety and security officers particularly came under focus because there was such concern about preventing terrorist attacks at sea. So there is a momentum building, but we haven't got the action that needs to follow from that just yet.
At 10:25 a.m. on February the 3rd, 2013, 24-year-old American Jackie Castronellis is found dead in her cabin aboard the Seven Seas Voyager just as the ship is docking in Darwin. She is the lead singer and star attraction of the ship's Cirque Voyager show. On the night of her death, Jackie had joined fellow cast members for drinks before heading to her cabin.
The next day, when she hadn't emerged, Jackie was found dead in her bed, lying on her back.
Mark Brimble, Australian head of the International Cruise Ship Victims Organisation, has studied the case.
They found Jackie dead on the ship, they got her off, and they turned that ship around and got it back out again. So they were gone before there was any chance to be able to preserve further evidence that could have been obtained, or further interviews with passengers and crew members on board at the time.
Just as with the Diane Brimble case 10 years before, what followed the discovery of Jackie's body on the ship as it sailed into Darwin, according to her family, was a shoddy investigation by the local Northern Territory Police.
Darwin detectives say they're no longer treating the death of a young cruise ship worker as suspicious.
That, and says the family, a sense of indifference from Regent Cruises.
I don't think they cared. I think they wanted to get that ship out of port, and they were released from port within 30 hours.
A family whose daughter died on a trip overseas looking for answers and pushing for her case to be reopened.
Jackie's mother, Kathy Castronellis, has spent years and a small fortune investigating her daughter's death.
I feel very uncomfortable with what happened, that there's something not right. Maybe the police didn't know what happened, and for Regent, they maybe didn't know exactly what happened, but they wanted that ship back out on its route.
Life.
An inquest would determine that Jackie died of a rare genetic disorder called sudden death syndrome. But it's a cause of death that cannot be proven with absolute certainty, and there's no history of it in Jackie's family. Kathy says if Jackie had died of foul play, the cruise company and police gave themselves little chance of finding out.
Everything went floating off. They let the ship go off. They didn't test the room. They didn't re-interview the ex-boyfriend. They just didn't do so many things. They should have just covered the bases. If they had just done their job correctly, at least we'd have more answers than questions. I guess that's where we are now. Why couldn't you just take the time to do your job right for the sake of this family and for this young girl?
If you become the victim of crime at sea, the industry says the ship's onboard security officers are specially trained and that there are procedures in place for the collection of evidence, the preservation of crime scenes and the obtaining of statements.
Stop. Settle.
But critics believe the security guards who are ship employees face a conflict of interest and are potentially burdened with the pressure to protect the reputation of the cruise line. Federal MP Graham Perrott, who chaired a parliamentary inquiry into the cruise industry, says it was found some security guards feared there'd be consequences when reporting crimes because it was negative news few wanted to hear.
If the sheriff can lose their job for reporting a crime to their boss, well, then they make sure that the deputy doesn't tell them about crimes. So if this squeaky wheel is making a lot of noise, well, then suddenly they've found that they're not taken on the next cruise. It's as simple as that.
Mark Brimble argues an independent authority on board is vital.
On a ship, who do you call? Who is it that you would get through to that could be independent enough to be able to help you in a very, very difficult position?
The coronial inquiry into Diane Brimble's death proposed a solution. Make it a condition of passage for cruise ships operating from Australian ports that the company pay for Australian Federal Police officers to be on board every ship.
The governments can easily control what can and cannot occur on a cruise ship as a condition of entry to their nation. It's just that they won't. You can't deter crime without police. You can't stop murders and deter murderers unless there are police on board. You can't stop rape unless there are criminal investigators. You can't stop drug supply and drug distribution unless there are police there able to investigate, arrest and detain those persons.
Nobody would disagree, perhaps, but it can't be done that easily.
No, I mean, I agree that that is what might be needed, but the absolute difficulty in the end is that you don't have police who can go and operate in another country. So by saying we're going to put Australian police on a vessel that's flagged to Bahamas, you're essentially saying, well, we're sending Australian police into the Bahamas to arrest people. And that's not going to be possible unless Bahamas consents to that.
But you can say to them, you're not bringing your cruise ships to Australia unless Australian Federal Police are on board to be able to investigate and deter crime. I mean, there needs to be that deterrent.
I mean, we can have conditions on vessels coming into our ports, absolutely, but we can't have
like
those...
what, though?
Well, you could set conditions similar to saying that if you're coming in, you have to adhere to these particular standards.
Why wouldn't the industries themselves want to? What's at stake here?
It's the financial imperatives.
It's money.
It's always the money it comes back to.
But it can be done. Glacier Bay in Alaska has legislated random inspections of cruise ships to prevent environmental crimes like illegal waste and sewage disposal.
They're dealing with environmental issues.
Industry expert Professor Ross Klein argues the same system could be implemented for all crimes on cruise ships.
There's no reason why that same model could not be used for independent observers and independent investigators for purposes of crime.
And Ron?
Look, governments have got to have a bit of courage and say, you're not making money out of Australians unless Australians are protected. You can't protect them. They need an independent police force to protect them.
If there is one terrible fear about cruising miles out to sea, it would have to be falling overboard. And whether deliberately or by accident, it does happen. Reports show up to 25 people a year go overboard from cruise ships, almost 350 since 2000. It's a tiny percentage of total passenger numbers. But there's a way to quickly detect if a passenger has fallen from the ship with person overboard technology. It relies on advanced sensors or images that alert the crew of a person overboard in real time.
Very few cruise ships around the world today with passengers have person overboard systems 10 or 11 years after they were mandated. And they're gaming the system and they're continuing their arrogance. I mean, I think that's just a reflection of how they play us as consumers, giving them money, and they don't really take responsibility for taking care of their passengers.
Federal MP Graham Perrott chaired a parliamentary inquiry into the cruise industry in 2013, which decided that person overboard technology should be installed on ships operating from Australian ports.
That was recommended in our report back in 2013, and the industry has not responded to that recommendation. So that's a simple piece of technology. We know that in a post-COVID world, there'll be more people outside near the handrails. There's plenty of profits to be made. Let's see them step up. We should make sure that we can save some lives in the future.
These systems have been on the market now for more than 10 years, so they're avoiding putting them on, which would save lives.
Why avoid that?
I think there's two reasons. One is that the systems cost money, even though it's a trivial amount. I think the other part is that when a person goes overboard and there's a lawsuit, the key to liability is that the cruise line had to have known. If they put a person overboard system on a cruise ship, they're admitting that they have foresight of people going overboard. They've admitted that it's a problem.
Perhaps the ultimate nightmare is when the ship sinks.
On the 13th of January 2012, the cruise ship Costa Concordia ran aground off the Italian island of Giglio. It capsized and eventually sank in shallow waters, claiming 32 lives. An investigation found that Captain Francesco Scattino had abandoned the sinking ship while 300 passengers were still on board.
For many critics of the cruise industry, the Costa Concordia disaster revealed a terrible and frightening truth.
What became visible when the Costa Concordia went down is that the cruise industry disregards the provision within the safety of life at sea that requires that a ship can be evacuated within 30 minutes of an abandoned ship call. That could not happen on the Costa Concordia.
And then there are the shameful examples of cruise liners illegally dumping rubbish and sewage at sea.
It's illegal polluting and dumping of bathroom, kitchen and oil-contaminated waste.
The largest cruise line company in the world, Carnival, has been fined nearly $70 million for environmental crimes since 2016.
The largest ever criminal prosecution for intentional dumping and pollution by a ship.
The International Council of Cruise Lines says it has a zero-tolerance policy towards illegal dumping, but that doesn't stop it happening.
International Council of the Cruise Line says it's a condition of membership not to violate environmental laws, but the companies that have paid millions upon millions of dollars in fines for environmental violations have never lost their membership. So it's just emptiness.
15 years ago, there were some really not so great stories coming out of particularly Alaska and some of the waste problems they had in Alaska.
Quentin Long is co-founder of Australian Traveller magazine and a cruise advocate.
They are working pretty hard. Now, can they work harder? Everybody can. But the industry, in my experience, has been incredibly responsive to general community interests, and right now environmental is very much one of them.
The last major incident of cruise ships dumping waste in Australian waters was in 2018, when P&O's Pacific Explorer, owned by Carnival Cruises, discharged 27,000 litres of food waste on the Great Barrier Reef. Expert in law of the sea, Professor Natalie Klein believes it's time the government set tougher regulations.
If we want to protect the resources, the environment, there's just a price that we have to be willing to pay, and until there's recognition and acceptance of that, we're not going to be able to get the laws to align and the companies to follow as they need to.
And what's your view on self-regulation?
Self-regulation doesn't go far enough.
It can be the family vacation of a lifetime or a holiday from hell.
What do we want?
And whether they're aware of the potential dangers or not, including getting COVID, passengers are enthusiastically jumping back on board. Since COVID swept the world, the industry has taken a financial beating. To literally stay afloat, it's had to introduce new measures to try and ensure passengers' health.
It's been pretty impressive by the cruise industry to develop protocols in conjunction with health authorities that are so comprehensive. And I pay credit to them for doing it, but it is something they had to do to give people confidence on their ability to travel on cruise ships. My concern is history shows that a lot of these standards only apply when it's in their economic interests to apply.
Tonight, our experts have highlighted the danger zones and where they believe changes are still needed to ensure passenger safety. Starting with independent policing, as recommended by Ron Honig and the Brimble Inquest 20 years ago.
There is no other solution to deter crime and to protect human life than having police on board. And that's the only way every town, every society, every city, every nation operates.
Our panel also believes cruise ships should be required to install person overboard technology.
You will proceed to your assembly stations.
And that before boarding, passengers should be given clear and concise information about crime, accidents, health and safety, as recommended by Graham Perrett's Federal Parliamentary Inquiry.
We're a first world country, a wealthy country, an ageing country where people like to go on cruises. We need to work with the cruise industry. Waiting for them to get it right won't work. We need government to step up.
Natalie, what is your message to passengers who are thinking about embarking on their next trip?
The passengers need to be aware of what protections they actually have. They have to be aware that they're leaving the protection of Australian law when they are on that ship and voyaging onto the high seas. And until we really get serious about the accountability, about finding ways to enforce, then we're going to keep having tragic circumstances that we're talking about today and that we see in the news.
According to Professor Ross Klein, the greatest force for change will and should come from the tens of thousands of Australians who love to cruise. He says if passengers are unhappy and stop booking trips, the industry will take notice.
What we learned in the US, it was grassroots pressure on Congress that led to those changes. And I think it's the Australian consumer that needs to first be educated, but then also be motivated to begin to put pressure, not just on government, but put pressure on the industry because they're not going to go on the ships if the industry doesn't take their health and welfare seriously. The industry is very sensitive to political pressure, to economic pressure, and if they start losing passengers, they're going to start changing their ways.
So it's passenger power.
That's what I would argue. I think that's the only way we're going to see meaningful change, because then they can't argue about, laws or international regulations or anything else. It comes down to, we need to make money and we need those passengers on board, and we'll do what we have to do to make that money.
And Mark Brimble, what do you think Australians should, at the very least, request and demand?
I think every Australian should have the right to know what safety or security they may be giving up as a result of going onto a ship. They should know and be able to make an informed decision to be able to make sure that their family is safe, their relatives are safe, and that they can go around and come back. And when on board that ship, also know that there is somebody that they can contact, or somebody they can go to, whether it's a crime, an assault. I'm tired of the cruise industry trivialising the percentages. That has to stop. We've got to all know what's happening on those cruise ships, and that these companies that are making very good profits are ensuring and carrying out the responsible things to ensure the safety and security of every Australian.
It's not something we naturally think of when we're embarking on our dream trip. But whatever dangers you face on land, you're going to face on the high seas. In the end, it really all comes down to you, the passenger, making yourself aware of your rights and the risks before boarding. I'd like to thank you all for taking part in this evening's program, and I'd like to thank you. I'm Liz Hayes. Good night. Hello, I'm Liz Hayes, and thank you for watching Under Investigation. Subscribe to our channel now for exclusive clips, and don't miss out on full episodes of Under Investigation on 9Now